everybody. I'm sitting here with Dr. Andrew Bard Schmookler. He's a prize-winning author, former Democratic candidate for Congress in Virginia's very red Shenandoah Valley, a former talk show host, summa cum laude graduate of Harvard University, and he's the author of several books and is working on another one titled A Better Human Story. Welcome to the show, Doctor.
Well, thank you. Looking forward to our conversation.
I'm looking forward to it too. We've been working on this to try and get you on here for a while, and I apologize for the delay. It's a pleasure to have you on here. So I wanted to just start off pretty simple with just kind of what got you started in this kind of business, because politics is not something, or even public commentary even, is not something that is always a very easy thing to continue to start doing, and much less continue. So I was wondering what kind of started you off, what keeps moving you forward, and then we can move into the other more specifics.
I think I should start by characterizing what it is. Starting me off with what, the politics is, it's something which has arisen in the last 20 years because the nature of the crisis in America called me into that. But I would characterize what it is I've been doing for more than half a century as trying to show the forces that are at work in the human world that we need to overcome if we're going to be able to build a world that we want more than the way we've got it now, with all the suffering and all the injustice and et cetera. So and then how did I get started? Well, there have been different phases, as I just indicated. Starting in 2004, I felt a profound conviction that something very destructive was rising on the right that needed to be fought and defeated. So there's a whole story about how that came to me. And besides that, there's a whole story about how I have tried for almost 20 years to fight this force that's taken over the right. But that's the most modern, late life embodiment of the larger calling. How I actually got started on this was an experience in 1970 that gave me an answer to a very big question that I had been asking since 1968, when the world was falling apart around me, the Vietnam War and the Soviets in Prague and the riots in Paris and the Chicago Convention. And all the assassinations. I was just out of college. I thought I was just going to fit into the world, like my dad had, who was a professor of economics. And all of a sudden, it didn't make any sense to just fit into the world, because I was wondering, how did the world get so destructive and tormented? I hadn't seen the world quite that way until that point in my life. And so I dropped out of graduate school and I wrestled with the question, what should I do and why is the world like this? And then one day in 1970, I had an experience, a visionary experience, where I was shown the answer to my question, or at least a big piece of it. And the other question was answered also, because I made a promise I was going to develop what I had seen and convey it to my fellow human beings. And by the way, 53 years later, well, 52 plus, it still holds water. And I have been on a mission to show what I've seen, because it has profound implications for understanding our history, understanding our nature, and understanding the nature of the challenges that we face as a species if we're going to survive on this planet.
Yeah, and one of the things I'm obviously not been going at this as long as you have, in terms of the breadth of your experience, your writing, or just your experience with talk radio. But I remember one of the things that really got me into public commentary was really time. I have always been involved in public policy and political talk, particularly when I was at college. I liked writing a lot about pretty much anything I could get my hands on, or anything I could get my attention to focus consistently on. But when I was writing there, one of the things I really wanted to emphasize was the importance of an informed public on things that may help people and really prevent as much harm to my fellow citizens as possible. And it seems like you had a similar experience in that you saw the world getting more and more chaotic. You saw movements trying to really change the world for a better for the better, but many of those people who pushed for them died horribly or violently. And it to you, you if I may characterize this, it seems like you were trying to find a really good answer to prevent such suffering again. Would you consider that an accurate characterization?
Well, I don't know quite where to go with that. The thing is, I don't think we understand what it means to be a species on the planet that's done what our species alone has done. Um, when I was growing up, 1950s and 60s and studying history and like that, when people talked about, like the origins of things, then it was Athens and Jerusalem and, like that, the early civilizations, that's where they started. That's ancient history. But in fact, our species has done something as part of the system of life on Earth, out of which we emerged through a 3.5 billion year process. And only in the last 10 or 12,000 years have we done something that no other animal ever did, at least not on this planet, though I expect it's happened many places, many times. And it has profound implications. We stepped out of the niche in which we evolved biologically by inventing our way of life. And that creates an unprecedented situation of anarchy. It unleashes a force. And actually, what I've tried to show in recent years is the force that unleashes helps to explain how something like today's Republican Party can come into existence. And it's got, so the idea of my elderliness or whatever I have to confess to of being an old man. But the central idea of my young adulthood is in that book, The Parable of the Tribes, over my shoulder. But the idea of this stage, which integrates with that, is that there's such a thing as a coherent force that works to make the human world worse. And I've shown it in several ways, that it spreads a pattern of brokenness. And so once in a while, I saw this because something happened on the American right that I don't think has ever happened with an American political party before. It became consistently destructive, so that we gradually moved to the point where I, for one, cannot think of a single word or deed by which they made things better rather than worse. That is an unusual situation in the world. It's not the first pure case. But once in a while, some actor in the world, in this case, a political party, and in the case of Germany in the 1930s and early 40s, it was a whole nation. Every once in a while, there emerges an actor that is consistently spreading a pattern of brokenness. And we can see how it emerges, and it traces back to, it is a very dangerous thing to become a civilized creature.
Mm-hmm.
Any creature on any planet, I say that I claim to have just demonstrated the truth of this. Any creature on any planet, anywhere in the cosmos that crosses that line and starts to extricate itself from the niche in which it evolved biologically. And those niches are not random. They're just put together in a way that perpetuates life. Any creature will be compelled will launch itself onto a destructive social evolutionary process. And it unleashes a force that you can trace that results in things like white supremacy and corporate greed and a spirit of deceptiveness and cruelty, all the things that have come together that are demonstrable in today's Republican Party. You can see that all of these get fed from that original spring.
So I just sorry about that. That there was some person attempting to post a scam in the comment section. Um, so that disruptive force, I think it's really important to emphasize what we would call that force, because I do see to some extent that there is an element of our society that does not particularly respond well to having a sort of civilized society. They don't respond well to structure. They don't respond well to authority or justice for that matter. I think recently some of the recent police killings demonstrate that very well. But I'm wondering, on an institutional level, how do we like examine that force you're talking about?
Well, I grew up in an America where the two parties were mixtures of the destructive and the constructive. You could critique, you could find merit in some of what each party did, and you could find fault. But the current situation is one where the very survival of American democracy is imperiled. And it is not imperiled from two sides. It is imperiled from one side of a polarized political divide. It compels the other side to be the defender because that's what we got. We got a two-party system, and we got a political arena where the helm of the country is determined by elections between those two parties. And if one party is consistently working in directions of a fascistic nature, and we could talk about, I've got a piece about the battle between democracy and fascism, then the other party has got the job of defending democracy. And I can see in every day's newspapers, there are ways in which that is actually what's going on. I would love to have another day where I can be critical of the Democratic Party for its various shortcomings, like every human institution,
Yeah.
But it has actually become something rather pure because they're engaged in a battle where the other side is continually making things worse. So every time there's a battle, the Democrats have to be pushing in the opposite direction. So they end up looking pretty damn good. And in terms of the nature of the challenge of this moment, the immediate challenge is to remove power from the hands of the Republican Party, so that American democracy, and whether the Republican Party needs to transform itself back into a normal American conservative party, or whether it needs to die like the Whig Party died, but for very different reasons, back in the 1850s, and be replaced by a different party like the Republican Party was in 1856. So I don't know which way it's got to go, but they got to be defeated. And we get evidence of that every day.
Oh my God! Like just the conduct between Marjorie Taylor Greene and Lauren Boebert, those two alone are demonstrations of the failure of the Republican Party and its membership. Especially when Marjorie Taylor Greene was for a time one of the most donated to person. Can't speak today. One of the people who has been like very well funded by conservative donors. She was one of the biggest recipients, and yet I do still also worry because this pattern among the Republican Party, this shift towards what you and I would generally agree, I think, is at least a fascistic or at least close to fascistic political party. That did not come out of nowhere. That pattern, and you
Oh, no.
mentioned this before, with like the likes of Rush Limbaugh, Fox News, how they've kind of altered their rhetoric in such a way that it is becoming less about governing and more making sure the Democrats and liberals don't
Well,
really win.
ultimately, it's sort of about bringing out the worst of people and feeding the greed of the class that the party is actually serving. It's exploiting the people who they send all these cultural warfare things. They don't give a damn about abortion. Most of them, I don't mean all of them, they don't give a damn about the unborn or even the born. I mean, you can see that that's the case. That's a way of getting. I mean, it's a two-part party. It's a party that gets its power from votes. So it has to enlist the allegiance of a lot of people. And it's a party that works then to get the plutocracy, the wealth and power they want, even though they're already the wealthiest and the most powerful. But the concept of brokenness is vital to understanding this force. And I let me just demonstrate rather than try to give too much of a definition of brokenness.
Yeah.
I already have in a way. I wrote a piece called "How Did the Republican Party Come to This?" And here is my thesis about it. In a way, it's sort of an artifact of history, like it didn't have to happen. But see, if you ask what was the biggest force of, what are the biggest forces of brokenness that did most to keep America from realizing its ideals in the period from, say, 1830 to 1940 something? The answer, I think, would be one, the force of racism and white supremacy, and the two, the force of corporate greed as the whole corporate system blossomed into power, leading up to Teddy Roosevelt in the progressive period. But those are the two forces. And the thing is that they were divided between the two parties. The Democratic Party, from before the Civil War all the way up to the passage of the civil rights legislation in the 1960s, was the home of the white supremacist force in America. Jim Crow got what they needed from the Democratic Party. Even FDR, who's a hero of mine, had to pay sacrifice on the altar of the segregationists. And meanwhile, the Republican Party was the home of the corporate greed. And we could, the whole issue of corporate greed and what the dynamics are that make corporations sort of inhuman, greedy things. But that force was under the umbrella of the Republican Party from, even Abraham Lincoln in a way. He was a former Whig and all that. But particularly when you get to the late 19th century, the laws that get passed, the Supreme Court decisions that get handed down, they're all being run for the corporate system, and the Republicans are winning every election until they divide the vote in 2012 and Woodrow Wilson gets in. Oh, and Grover Cleveland, too. I shouldn't leave him out. But when Lyndon Johnson signed the civil rights legislation in the mid-1960s, he turned to whoever it was, or maybe later, I don't know. I haven't seen the video. He says, we've lost the South for a generation. He understood that the white majority was going to be really pissed at the Democrats for saying that the system of racial oppression that they were invested in had to come down. So then we've got one party that houses the two major forces of brokenness that we had in American society for over a century. And the result is that force of brokenness that they both, in a sense, partake of in different ways. But that's the point, is between the greed and that racial hatred and domineeringness and exploitation and cruelty, there is a kindredness, a pattern of brokenness that they share. So both of those ally together. And that's not the only thing going on with the Republican Party. But I think that created the possibility that one of America's two major political parties that used to divide the biggest forces of brokenness now had them under one tent, taking over and then working to take over the country in very ugly ways.
So and that's an interesting way of putting it, because on the one hand, when I look at the Republican Party and its previous history, a lot of it was, even though it was nominally the party that acted in the defense of African Americans, to the point where during Reconstruction, if you said you were a Republican, there was a good chance the Klan would show up at your house. There were still elements of it, I think, that did have, at the very least, a how do I say this? A paternalistic view of African Americans, to the point that when they no longer really thought that they could maintain Reconstruction, they made that compromise where they agreed to withdraw troops in exchange for the presidency for the Republic from the Democrats.
Oh,
And
it's almost always going to be the case
yep,
that whoever's operating in a society filled with a certain kind of brokenness, that it's going to be hard for anybody to completely escape it. I mean, even Abraham Lincoln didn't necessarily think that blacks were the equals of whites, though he cared passionately about their rights and their well-being.
yeah,
So, that's always the case. But the the problem with the Republican Party of earlier eras was it was the party of the country club and the corporate boardroom,
yep,
and that's what they did that impeded America from realizing some of our concepts of justice. I live in a right to work state, that prevents unionization, and people are sold a bill of goods about this is about their right to work. It's not. It's and the Republicans of Virginia, where I live, are always try to fool people into thinking they're being protected by this, where they're really being exploited for the sake of the employers.
yep. And I I think it's really interesting that you mentioned that exploitation, because really, even when the shift to bring white supremacy as a main component of the Republican Party, when Lee Atwater confessed that that's what they were doing with Nixon, uh, really, that is a form of exploitation in and of itself as well, because not only are they upholding a hierarchical system of oppression against African Americans and people of color, but they're also exploiting what really is a faulty way of thinking from other people. They're ignoring the conditions of actually helping people because they can just convince a white voter, well, at least I'm not part of this group, or hey, at least I'm sticking it to the people I hate instead of looking at their lives. Um, and that kind of, to move to more recent times, that kind of is what we've seen with Trump as well. His demeaning rhetoric, his open hostility towards African Americans, his history of literally not like treating them as proper tenants with respect. Those things seem to be a constant component of his character and his rhetoric, even to the point where others have actually begun to consistently use it themselves. And I know you wrote about this, and I just want to get the quote here real quick. Trump stands there before us, vividly showing the extraordinary spirit that animates him. It's a spirit that's directly opposite from what our cultural traditions have conceived of the good. Do unto others is very different from hang Mike Pence. Love thy neighbor as yourself is the opposite of love only yourself, while not caring a whit about anyone else. And
Well,
I think that's a very strong characterization of what we're seeing with the Republican Party, which is like not just brokenness, prejudice, or corporatism, but outright malice for malice's sake.
one of the is following along there and bringing back in the concept of brokenness. I live in a 70-30 Trumpian area. Uh, the people I live among, many of them are intelligent and decent people. And they will articulate in all sincerity a variety of values. And when I did talk radio here back in the 1990s, I really appreciated the Christian values, the reverence for the Constitution, uh, uh, and the value they placed on good character. I had plenty of conversations on the radio with people who seemed lovely to me in their articulation of such values and application of it to how they live their lives. And then there comes along somebody like Trump, who, and like the whole Republican Party, actually. I mean, Trump is the epitome of not Christian, not respectful of the Constitution, terrible lack of character. But we can see it in the Republican House, what's just happened in the Republican House. They're remarkably lacking in any of those kinds of decency. And yet, the people that I talked with on the radio who had those values, and I take them at their word. It wasn't baloney. They meant it, but they support the opposite of what they said they valued. And I think of this as a kind of brokenness.
Mm.
It is a disconnect. If you see them if you deal with them in their businesses, you see them in their neighborhoods or see them in their churches, there's a consistency. But as soon as they get into the political realm, they don't see that what they're supporting is the very opposite. And I've been working, I can't tell you how many years, but certainly increasingly since Trump captured the whole Republican Party. I mean, before some of the evils were hidden under a semi-plausible, but now it's so open. I have tried to understand, how do the intelligent and decent people I know believe the unbelievable and not see what's right in front of their face, which isn't even hidden. I mean, Richard Nixon hid his crimes. We had to get tapes and witnesses and stuff like that before the Senate, before we really could say this guy has to be impeached. But Trump was doing it right in front of us. I mean, it's just, he's betrayed the country at almost every turn. These patriots, how can they embrace a guy who betrays the country with Ukraine, with the pandemic, with his election lie? I mean, he's willing to destroy almost anything to get what he wants for himself. I mean, it's perfectly obvious. I have intelligent neighbors, don't see it, and I don't understand how.
Yeah, and I'll be honest, like when I first started like doing this kind of commentary and streaming, I actually did a stream attempting to cover the Democrats' senatorial success in Georgia with John Ossoff and Raphael Warnock. And while I was streaming, that's when the Capitol attack occurred. Someone actually was in the chat, and they specifically told me they're storming the Capitol. And I watched live when that was going on, and that was the first presidential election I was legally allowed to vote in because I had just turned 18. I turned 18 after 2016, literally the same month.
You are a
Trump was inaugurated.
young fellow.
Yeah, I'm 24. I shaved the beard a little bit, so I don't look as old as I usually do, but I appreciate that. I still feel sometimes like I have the back of a 85-year-old, but that's just because I'm really skinny.
Does your back hurt? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, scoliosis, and I usually
I'm
get that
sorry.
every now and then. Yeah, it's one of those things. But what I do kind of think of this as this frustration where we see that brokenness, that violent lashing out that we see in the Republican Party, and it's particularly concerning because a lot of it, I think, has to do with propaganda and framing.
Yeah.
In my hometown,
If these people are broken, it's because people have worked to make them more broken.
yes, exactly. And there was actually an incident in my hometown. I'm from DuPage County, and there was an issue in Cook and DuPage where people were literally like sending out fake newspapers from an organization called the Local Government Information Services (LGIS), and these things contained a bunch of racist propaganda, like just racist propaganda attacking Mayor Lightfoot, Governor Pritzker, and many more people. And what's so concerning is I'm not really sure. Like, thankfully, there's still some local news institutions in my hometown that can be taken care of. But in a lot of cases, local news is being killed, and there's a lot of propaganda that is taking its place, and that's the only place people get local news. So I was wondering, how does the fight against brokenness work to solve that problem if people can't even get information to like consciously like understand what's going on in their communities because they're being lied to.
Well, I, I see that as a part of the larger problem of how do we
Mhm.
strengthen democracy in America. One of the things that you're implying, I'll state, is that uh, local news is necessary to keep local government from getting too corrupt. Um, you know, we've got the New York Times and the Washington Post that I think have been doing a well, I mean, I can find fault with both of them, this or that, but they have broken many very important stories that are the exposing of which, most recently, this thing with William Barr and John Durham,
Yeah.
uh, the complete fraud and hypocrisy of that. I mean, just seeing that should be enough to alert any sane and intelligent person that there's something rotten here. You know, how did something like this get to be? If you look into it, the disease just keeps on spreading until it's this whole big force of brokenness. But so the where was I going? Do you know? Can you
Yeah,
help me?
we were talking about like news media and local. How does the fight
Yeah,
against
we
brokenness?
we need to do a lot of things to strengthen our democracy. Um, the education that our kids get. Teachers that I know think that the critical thinking abilities of Americans have declined in the last 40 years. Um, there's a lot of stuff. I just wrote a piece about ranked choice voting, which I think is a remedy for one of the problems in democracy, which is that if you've got a lot of candidates without ranked choice voting, you're likely to get some kind of extreme outcome.
Mhm.
Somebody can get the nomination with less than 30% of the vote, and that person could be somebody that all the rest of the party really doesn't want, but they've got a faithful following, like Al Capone had a faithful following.
Mhm.
But so I think that to make an Illinois reference for you, I think that ranked choice voting, uh, local news, better education, um, tackling the way kids get brought up. I mean, what I think is going on with my neighbors, though I say I don't understand it, and I don't, I do see a lot of pieces of the picture. And one of the pieces of the picture that I see is that there are ways in which children get raised around here, and I think throughout the conservative side of America, that create certain kinds of vulnerabilities. And I could go further with what those vulnerabilities are, but there are better ways of bringing up kids that don't make people so vulnerable to being misled by a demagogue.
Yeah, and I think of the other thing, because education is a critical component of this. Obviously, there's limitations to what we can do to save already dying newspapers or local newspapers that haven't really adequately made the shift to social media to defend themselves. But one of the things I think is also really important is to get people to realize how important good local news is. One of the things I'd like to see as time goes on with education is to teach people from when they're very young how to teach them media literacy.
Yeah, yeah,
What are the biases of the newspapers they're reading, the social
that's
media
been
sites?
important for a long time, but it's become even more important than it was when I was teaching about such things 20 some years ago. So yeah, that's a big deal. People, I mean, how come Fox News is able to just pivot? Like one day they're saying the other thing, and then they got a reason to flip, and when they have to back down, there's no discussion of we used to say this. What does it mean that we're now saying this? It's
Yeah,
an intelligent viewer who's not in some kind of a trance state
yeah.
would infer these people can't be trusted, but they don't.
Well, and I think the other thing was there was I remember I was going through this when this was revealed by the Gawker. They went through the Nixon library and they found documents, not by Rupert Murdoch. It was the other guy who Roger Ailes. Roger Ailes,
Right.
who when his document, which was titled how to put the I can't remember the title off the top of my head. I think it was titled something to the effect of how to put the GOP on TV. And it was a proposal that he wrote to Richard Nixon to propose getting conservative views on a platform that would help combat traditional news outlets. And one of the things he said in there is that people are not really with TV and really the cable news cycle of Fox News, you don't have to think. You like being told what to think. And I
Well,
think there's an oh, go ahead.
Um, I think it's time for me to get a little more balanced because this is a systemic problem in America.
Oh yeah.
What happened on the right could only happen because there was a problem on the left as well, meaning the liberal side, meaning the Democrats. I don't mean lefty. I mean the Democrats were incapable of recognizing what they were up against. They did not see that with the rise of the propagandist Gingrich and Limbaugh, there was something happening that the poisoning of the American mind. You know, you introduced me saying I was a talk radio host. I was a talk radio host because when I heard what Rush Limbaugh was doing to his 20 million ditto heads, this is back in 1992. I determined I was going to do everything I could to counter what he was doing to the American mind. So I went on the air on the station where Rush Limbaugh was on for 3 hours every day. I wasn't on nearly that much, but I went on there to try to do the opposite. And I don't mean by selling a bunch of lies that serve the purposes of the liberals and the Democrats. I mean by having honest inquiry. That was what I tried to do for 10 years on that station, is to talk about the questions of meaning and value that we face in our lives, some of them being the controversial ones, and to try to get people like to not accept the kind of propaganda that was coming their way, that was getting in the way of thinking about the other side, for example, in a way that wasn't demonizing. I was the other side. I'm a Yankee, a cosmopolitan, an intellectual, not, all these, and a Democrat, all these things that they were not. I'm not a fundamentalist Christian traditionalist, but I was a human being with them. But I eventually lost that battle because the powers that were taking over the right, by the time we get to Karl Rove, they couldn't hear me anymore.
Mm. And that's the thing that like worries me a lot, because like I have friends who are on the other side of me politically, and they very firmly disagree with me on a lot of things, and they're able to handle it respectfully most of the time. I'll admit I get temperamental as well, so I'm not gonna pretend like don't have my moments. I do. But what's disturbing, I think, really is not just like there's this propaganda or this misrepresentation or this outright lying that is consistently made profitable, but it's incentivized and it causes people to be so hostile to members of their own community. Like the phrase we should be saying is we are all Americans,
Yeah,
but just a lot of the people, particularly in the way of like Sean Hannity and Fox News talks about liberals, it's almost as if they're othering people to the left of center to the point where their listeners won't recognize liberals as Americans anymore.
yeah, the demonization has been a very big deal, and as I said, I tried to counter it, but I was such a minor force. When people keep on selling you, oh, they're baby killers, they want to take your guns away, they want to unman you. In other words, you know, they're grooming kids. I mean, but you can see how it began with Gingrich. I mean, there was when I first started studying this stuff, I saw that Gingrich had been delving into the propaganda techniques used by is Goebbels, right?
Hmm.
He's the Nazi, the propagandist. Yeah.
Yep.
So I haven't confirmed that, but it seemed plausible. It seemed well documented at the time. And he had these tricks about how to get people to see. He would use liberal or Democrat in conjunction with the word abnormal, sort of a bypassing critical faculties to instill ways of thinking. Now, I don't know how well those things work, but the Nazis were pretty successful, and it looks to me like Gingrich was pretty successful. And then there's Limbaugh. When he talked about the other side, it was always dripping with contempt. He taught millions of people to think about liberals and Democrats not as people who might have reasonable values and be just as good people in their lives as people among conservatives, but as people who are contemptible. You could hear it. And years and years of this, and the Democrats never fought for the hearts and minds of the people who are getting poisoned, who are taking this demonizational poison into their souls and losing the ability to reach across and say, what good can we achieve together in the political realm, which is what democratic politics are supposed to be all about. That's what everybody in office is supposed to be thinking. Given the distribution of power, what can I do that will lead to good outcomes for the nation and its people? That's really the only real question for people holding office in democracy. But if you demonize the other side enough, you can get support for doing something that has nothing to do with that. It's all about making political war.
Well, and I think the other side of it, and it really kind of plays into the corporate greed stuff you were talking about earlier, is a lot of right wing media does a very good job of making a crap ton of money. Recently, there was a controversy surrounding two conservative, well, not two conservatives, a conservative YouTuber and podcaster by the name of Steven Crowder and the Daily Wire media company run by Ben Shapiro. And and one of the things that was revealed was that they were willing to offer Steven Crowder $50 million for 4 years just to have him on the show. Like meaning this, he would only have to work 4 days
So he
a
was a
week.
good propagandist. Is that what you're saying?
He's a very good propagandist. He's got millions of subscribers online, but he sorry, the cough's still a little bit of a issue. He wanted more, meaning he was convinced that not only could they throw money around, but he thought that the money was unacceptable. Um, what's interesting there, meaning they had money, $50 million to throw on one guy and provide an annual salary that's traditional like pundits and reporters and like
You think
CNN
that he
probably
was
never get.
you think he was an NFL quarterback or something?
Yeah, exactly. Like, yeah, and he was mad, and he's still mad at them. He's still fighting with them publicly. Um, so it's concerning because not only do you have uh, this hatred, but you have an entire network of media outlets specifically intending to promote that hatred. And I was wondering what solutions can there be to kind of counteract that, or is this just something that kind of comes with people selling prejudiced thinking?
Well, for one thing I want to say is I don't know how much the money is the motivating factor in right wing media. I know that a lot of money gets made, and and maybe I just I actually think that the greed is just one part of a broken spiritual picture, and
Hmm.
probably not the dominant one. Um, a lot of people don't get rich without making the world worse. I think that you know like with Newt Gingrich, we're dealing with a man who is willing to go on the floor of Congress in 1998 and condemn Richard Nixon. I mean, not Richard Nixon, Bill Clinton's sexual uh, um, wanderings when it turned out that he himself was betraying his marriage in a much more serious and ultimately immediately destructive way. I mean, what is it? What is the? It's shown about a person who's willing to do to have such glass house and still throw stones. It's a sociopath. So I think that we're dealing with not just the greed, but people who really are drawn to the ugliness.
Mm.
I mean, Donald Trump, he is greedy. There's no question. I mean, he does grifts. He's exploited his followers. The January 6th committee showed one of his abuses of his people to get more money for himself. I mean, that's certainly what he is. But he's something that's still much darker. If he was just greedy, he wouldn't be attracted to a guy like Putin, who we now see what a monster he is. A guy who's willing to destroy whole cities rather than admit that he made a huge blunder. I mean, that's the guy that Donald Trump went to. That is uglier than just greed.
So yeah, and that's where like I start to also think like it's not just like something where people can be like, oh, they're just doing it for money. Although I would say Steven Crowder may be probably doing it for money.
Maybe. I don't know.
I mean, I've seen his content quite a bit, and it's Rush Limbaugh. If Rush Limbaugh were still alive today, he'd probably be shaking Steven Crowder's hands all the time. But in terms of what I see right now, it seems as though, like you said, that this spiritual dimension, this element of we as a society have something fundamentally like broken within our core. And it's kind of hard, for me to figure out what exactly can be done to repair that core once there's already like such wild conspiracism, because you can't.
Let me say what my approach has been. I've been trying to awaken liberal America to the nature of the challenge we face. That was a very lonely job for a long time. I started in 2004. Had a blog called nonesoblind.org that's still on my website, where I documented that already with the Bush administration, the second Bush administration, great darkness was gathering. And I was trying to alert Democrats. First, I tried to recruit a couple of big-time people to do that alerting of Democrats, calling out what it was. I tried with John Kerry, and I tried with Bill Moyers, and then each of them was nice to deal with, but turned it down for reasons of exhaustion or old age or whatever. But I've been trying to awaken liberal America to this problem. And another book over my shoulder is called What We're Up Against. I try to lay out and show that the battle that we're engaged in is a battle against a coherent force that consistently works to spread a pattern of brokenness. And earlier you asked, what should we call it? And I like to call it a force of evil, because that actually fits with how evil has been understood traditionally in our Western civilization. But liberals don't like that idea. A lot of liberals recoil. They think they understand that evil is an antiquated word. But okay, call it a force of brokenness. Call it a force of destructiveness. But it can be shown. And we need to fight this thing for the thing that it is. We've got to fight it with the same kind of spiritual verve that we appreciate identifying with when we go to the movies and watch something like Star Wars or the Lord of the Rings trilogy or Avatar. We identify with those guys who are fighting evil. That's how it's presented in those movies. And we throw ourselves into it with a passion that only now am I starting to think, okay, the Democrats are calling it out. Only in the last few years, people like Adam Schiff and Jamie Raskin have called it out for what it is. And people like Tim Snyder, the fellow from Yale, who's getting a lot of good press for a lot of good work, showing something about the spirit of fascism and how it is played in the 20th century and is playing now in the 21st century. There is something rising in the society, and that is the first leg of winning this battle, is to arouse as many people as possible to be the Luke Skywalker or the Frodo Baggins or the Sully from Avatar in the battle that needs to be fought and won.
Well, I would 100% agree with you on that. But before we go, because I do have to end this stream soon, I do want to ask you, do you still? Geez, I cannot talk throughout this interview today. My lord, do you have faith that that process will come soon, or do you think it is still going to be a long-term fight that we are going to have to deal with for a generation or two?
Well, we've had 2 elections in the United States that dodged the bullet, just to put it that way. We didn't completely dodge the 2022 bullet, but I actually have written about how I think the Republicans will rue the day they won this small minority control of the House. I think they're in the process of destroying themselves, just like in a lot of the movies that I've always liked, the Gothic movies, where at the end evil destroys itself. And I'd be happy to talk more about that. But so we have Biden as president. If it had been Trump again, that would have been
It would have been
really
a disaster.
dangerous. But am I hopeful? I am hopeful, but it is a very dangerous moment still in America, and it remains to be seen whether American democracy will survive, or whether the 2030s in America will have something akin to the 1930s in Germany.
I would rather hope not.
Well, yeah, but that, a guy like Trump, and there are more, we've seen what DeSantis is willing to do in Florida.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a path here, and we don't know where that could lead. A Trump presidency, a DeSantis presidency, and then where are we by 2033? You can create all kinds of destructiveness. So the thing the long-term project, the short-term project is to essentially to take power away from the Republicans in as many ways as possible, as completely as possible, until it becomes something better or gets replaced. But the other thing that requires is for us to get out of these woods, besides the democratic side of things, getting motivated to fight something where the battle isn't politics as normal. This isn't what Americans have had to do before. This is a new situation in America. The menace of fascism that we have faced lately is not precedented, though we could talk about the 1850s. But the other thing, which is a longer term thing, is tens of millions of our fellow citizens who are our fellow Americans, whether we like it or not, we share a country, have been led into a very strange space where they don't see what's obvious, where they give their support to the opposite of what they believe in. And how do we move people who used to be somewhat positive players in American society away from supporting what makes things more broken, back towards supporting things that make America more whole? And I have a weekly op-ed column in the Shenandoah Valley and then over in Lynchburg, where Liberty University holds sway, though under new management. I experienced as a congressional candidate something so dark emanating out of Liberty University through the testimony of the people, good people who lived there. Anyway, I have a weekly column, and I don't claim that I'm doing anything to move good, intelligent people in the direction of good and intelligent role in American politics, given their values. I don't claim that I'm achieving anything. I'm just doing my best every week. I send them messages and I
Mhm.
get some flack.
It's the process, but I wanted to say thank you very much for coming on. You are always welcome back on the show to discuss this even further. Um, this is Dr. Andrew Schmookler, author of A Better Human Story. You can see his website in the banner on screen. And thank you all for listening, and I hope you all have a wonderful day.
May I add one thing about the
Certainly,
website?
certainly.
Um, I have my life's work has been trying to put together what I call an integrative vision about the human story, how to understand the forces shaping our world. I have put together an 8-part series on that you can find on that website uh, that at the moment is called my series on Three Quarks Daily, which is
Mhm,
where 6 of the pieces debuted in a fairly big public forum. But as the series is going to be called The Fateful Step. But
mhm.
anyway, if anybody finds interesting the way I think about some of these particulars that we've been talking about, I want to say that I've put a lot of stuff together that I think sheds a new light on our nature, our history, and the challenges that we face as a species. And I think it's a toss up whether 2 centuries from now we will have gotten our act together or we'll have destroyed ourselves as human civilization.
Well, with that out of the way, I again want to thank you very much for joining me, and I hope you all have a wonderful day. Be sure to check out all of his material, and you will also see this posted on YouTube and on my website. Thanks, everybody.